We're here to talk about kind of the collective imagination and imagination infrastructure, which is something that we've been thinking a lot about at my work over the last couple of years, feeling like, and even more so, I guess now in the wake of the pandemic, that we need more than ever deep transformations, and feeling like the only way in which that can come about is if we can really tap into our imaginations and think of alternatives or imagine alternatives, and particularly together. One of the things that we have done in the last year is set up something called the Emerging Futures Fund, which was a way of us starting to try and experiment with resourcing new narratives and collective imaginations led by communities across the UK. And that's something that I think over the last year we have recognised we want to do more of. And I think we're figuring out how to do that. What does it mean to resource and build capacity, grow capacity of communities to imagine together the futures that they desire and that they long for. And today we are lucky to have four amazing people join us who are all in one way or another either being funded through the Emerging Futures Fund or linked into it. And they're going to each share a bit about their work. And then we're going to, I might ask them a few questions, and then we're going to open up the conversation. So we have got Rabab from Gentle Radical. We have also got Emmy from Civic Square, Iris Andrews from New Constellations, and Fazana Khan, who is from Healing Justice London and also an associate at the Centre for Knowledge Equity. So I think we're going to start with Rabab. You're gonna kick us off.
Hi everyone, thank you Cassie for that really beautiful imagining. So essential to how we think about the future, to really kind of fast forward into what we want it to be. I just want to introduce myself briefly. My name is Rabab, and I'm a community and cultural practitioner based in Cardiff, and I run an organisation, relatively recent organisation called Gentle Radical. And I suppose we're fundamentally interested in how we do this work of democratising culture. So I wanted to respond to Cassie's invitation and to try and talk about imagination structures and infrastructures in relation to a couple of things. Hyperlocal contexts, and also I suppose this idea of perpetual friendship. So first of all, as a socially engaged artist and cultural practitioner, I think it's really useful to remind myself that the backdrop historically of so much community-focused cultural work has all too often taken the form of artists being parachuted in and then out of communities by institutions under the guise of cultural engagement, but often modelling processes that are extractive, many of us would argue colonial, that perceive communities as a resource to be mined, to meet institutional agendas. And in that process, there's often invariably some very problematic modelling of relations around power. So I suppose the opposite of that would be ecologies of cultural work where we can continually keep generating dialogues trained on the imagination, and dialogues trained on co-realizing radically different futures, as well as to be in forms and practicing forms of communality with the freedom to also get things wrong and rethink and reframe and reimagine. So the idea of constantly regenerative dialogues is really critical to how we're trying to think about the work. And we see friendship as a really critical building block and key ingredient in that process. And I remember recently, as part of the project that Cassie referred to, actually, that we're running in Cardiff with people, which sees us conducting mutual conversations with getting residents to talk to each other across the neighbourhood. And yeah, I ended up having a really rich conversation in someone's allotment, a local resident I hadn't met. I've not, and yeah, got invited to his allotment, and it was a really rich, profound dialogue. And I remember saying to a colleague afterwards, Derek, this resident, why, what is it? Why wouldn't we want to be in friendship with Derek, kind of in perpetuity? Why wouldn't we want to sustain forms of friendship and comradeship with everyone that we meet through our work? And we started, in a way, talking about how does friendship realistically and practically form the underlying foundation of community and cultural work. And that sounds like a really obvious thing to say, because we could argue, well, isn't a lot of that already happening? But I also think that the models that we've worked with historically mean that it's precisely that relationship which is truncated and cut short within cultural programs, which pick communities up, put them down when funding cycles come to an end, or when an institution's focus moves elsewhere. So I suppose I want to ask, what would lasting friendship look like as the basis of radically inclusive cultural formations? And what if we took the broken perpetual growth model of capitalism and mapped perpetual growth onto forms of friendship? What might perpetual friendship offer as a model for long-term, interdisciplinary, democratized, inclusive, intergenerational cultural practice and spaces that took root at hyperlocal levels and engaged a constant cross-pollination of neighbours and residents on a street-by-street level in their own permanent, exponentially flourishing mutual engagement? And for us at Gentle Radical, there are a few things that kind of underpin some of those infrastructures. The first thing is this model of what we call expanded outreach, that everyone in the organization needs to be involved in outreaching, which is a very strange term. But in other words, the onus for us is not on one individual or project officer to deal with participation or engagement, but that absolutely everyone across the organization and all of our collaborative associates, anyone who works with us, our volunteers, we are all involved in an interwoven and permanent, continual conversation with our neighborhood. And then there's, I suppose, the context of hyperlocality. So we feel that this model of working is also best realized within hyperlocal contexts, and that is critical to how we imagine radically different futures for ourselves. So Riverside in Cardiff, where we live and work, is a very small, diverse community with over 65 languages spoken in our neighborhood, of around 13,000 residents. But it's also an area that's arguably been enormously culturally under-resourced, where there's been very little cultural investment over the years historically. So how can hyperlocal focuses be a model for culturally restorative processes? So where is the imagination in all of this? I suppose for us, the most critical ingredient for an imagination infrastructure is actually its permanence, is the time-based nature of that proposition, is a community context which builds, essentially, is a community context where a street gets to know itself, where streets get to know each other and other streets, where people are in time permanently generating, visioning, leading, and manifesting the cultural needs of their street, of their neighborhood, where we can generate a permanent cultural exchange at ground level. And when we can do that, those dialogues in turn become the means whereby we can figure out how to how do we become economically sustainable in this neighborhood? How do we address food sovereignty in this neighborhood? How do we deal with rising intolerance and xenophobia? How do we address our climate futures? And that this thinking and this collaborating within a permanent frame of imagination becomes a kind of living, breathing curatorial frame for cultural and creative work that everyone is part of and is involved in. What we know from experience is this takes enormous amounts of time, and it requires a huge amount of slowing down enough so that we can hold space for ourselves and for the community, hold space for the interpersonal and healing work that inevitably arises within the processes of people coming together and trying to do things together. It requires us, as Adrienne Marie Brown tells us, to work at the pace of trust and at the pace of the health and well-being and viability of every entity in our enterprise. And that is a much slower pace than the kind of hyper productivity that we're used to under kind of systems of capitalism. And I suppose we also feel it requires a radical rethinking of how we define labor, that our labor also includes fundamentally and extends to the spiritual work of being in service to each other, of centering the dignity of each other, and of engaging in the work of sacred communality. So this idea of the imagination infrastructure needing to be a permanent, ongoing, hyperlocal, situated space in which those dialogues are continually generative. I'm going to end there and pass back to you, Cassie.
Lovely. Such evocative words as well when you're describing the work. It's really beautiful. I'm going to hand over now to Emmy. And actually, just whilst Emmy's unmuting, just to say, if you do start to put questions if you want in the chat, and then when all four speakers have spoken, I'll start to try and pull out some that we can ask. So yeah, put them in the chat as you have them. Emmy?
Hi everyone. Thank you so much, Rabab. That was so beautiful. So I'm Emmy. I'm one of the co-founders of Civic Square. And because I see a few people that I recognize in here, we previously used to be Impact Hub Birmingham. I feel like there's so much I could talk about. So I'm going to try and really just zoom in on a couple of key ideas in terms of the imagination infrastructure. When we transitioned from Impact Hub to Civic Square, we were really fascinated with the idea of what it means for us to realize some of what Cassie talked about in her opening visualization around the transition from one state and time of being that we could define into all sorts of different things, all sorts of different economic models. We could talk about capitalism, we could talk about many, many different things, into what we know is going to be quite a different future, both through necessity and through us just being kind of pushed off the edge of a cliff, most likely by Mother Nature. And so really understanding what does it look like to build infrastructure for that transition. And for us, we really wanted to focus on the scale of the neighborhood, both small enough and big enough to really go deep with the ideas, but big enough to really spread and look at what that might mean for many other places. And I think Rabab talked about that really, really beautifully, so I won't talk about that too much more. And we were interested in three really key areas. And I'm going to distill them right down just to some states of matter. And one was the everyday matter, the spaces, the places, the things we feel, experience, the things that almost disappear into, you don't realize they're there until they're gone. Maybe you have some of that experience from lockdown. Physical infrastructure is part of that. The relationships, the spaces, the streets we walk on, the experiences we have, which we can understand often at a scale of our neighborhoods. And then the dark matter, which some of you will know, we collaborate with some incredible partners like Open Systems Lab and Dark Matter Labs and many other partners across the world to really look at what the dark matter of this neighborhood scale social civic infrastructure change is going to look like. Land, what happens around the land, how do we rebuild a contract around land, how do we understand the future of economics at a neighborhood level, how do we look at some of the invisible structures, the rules and the codes and the contracts and the things that drive us, is another really big part of Civic Square's work. And I'll share a link to our site so you'll be able to see this distilled down. In complement to all of that, we think when you're investing in the everyday matter and the dark matter, investing in the dream matter is a really huge and important part of that transition. And I guess this whole panel will tell you all about why that's so important and other such incredible work that's happening at the moment. And so for us, we'd been thinking about that for a number of years. I guess also lots of the ideas that really built from the project I'm going to tell you about, which is called the Department of Dreams, also came from many of the intertwining non-Western cultures that many of us had come from as first or second generation immigrants to this country. And it felt like the imagination and that dream world is a way that could be more acceptably talked about in a way that wasn't associated to faith or to other ideas that sometimes almost get like just chucked out the room in any sort of serious social innovation space. And so I started to see those interplays many years ago and really enjoyed that, because it could turn up with the idea of spirituality and healing and imagination without the loadedness of who and what it's coming from. So that's just a couple of years ago, a few years ago during our days at the Hub, that really came to life. And then last year when the pandemic hit, we obviously had to change everything around. When you're planning for a big capital project and most of your work is in person, we decided to start to bring forward things that felt like they were really needed more now. And so we launched the Department of Dreams with the initial provocation of a Re-Festival, which was 6 days, about 100 plus speakers, 50 or so workshops, which were people from all over the world, all different backgrounds, communities, ideas, really talking about what dreaming, identity, imagination, foresight looked like for them. Everything from hearing Rabab Hopkins talk about what if to what is, and a lot of the visualization type way that Cassie explained to Fazana and to many other people who started to paint different visions. We had things from land contracts and the dark matter of neighborhoods all the way to the new Constellation project that were taking us to all different spaces. And what we really found from that was the absolute incredible appetite from so many different people to start to share these visions and ideas and build the spaces to start to explore. And there's loads I could talk about around what stops that, what's stopped it historically, what's happening, but I just want to tell you about the project for now because I've only got a couple of minutes. And that sort of came at a time really where it felt like the sector and much of the work Cassie and others were pioneering from a funder point of view meant that people were really starting to take this idea of being able to imagine out of our existing realities really, really seriously. So at the moment, when you head over to Department of Dreams, you can go in on our website, you can have a look at sort of the 100 plus talks from those days. We also simultaneously invested around about £100,000 into at the moment 100 different people and projects and things across the country working on tools, on ideas that we're going to be curating into the Dream Library. And we're also doing a second round of that now in the next few weeks and months. So at the moment, what we're interested in is really looking at what the local neighbourhood level infrastructure is to create the spaces, create the resources, the inspiration, remove the sort of insularity of the neighbourhood and understand what that could look like when we're imagining all the different cultures and ideas and perspectives from around the world. And then what it means to resource it, fund and invest in it, and then the pathways to starting to build some of that. And so for us, I think I'm really passionate about many different things, the kind of deep, spiritual rooted, non-Western histories that kind of can really bring that stuff to life. But I'm equally also passionate about our partners at Open Systems Lab, who create new imaginations for a new land contract, or at Dark Matter when they're talking about how we can understand our relationship with trees differently. I guess I don't necessarily just see imagination in this way as just that more I don't even know what the right word is, but the more dreamy space. I think these things can interplay together. And that's why I'm so excited about what it will mean to build the infrastructure of all those different scales and layers and start to go on that journey Cassie described. So yeah, thank you so much. And I'll pass over back to Cassie.
Thanks, Emmy. And yeah, I've just put in a link to, I don't know if that's the latest Civic Square Dreams portal, but I love the idea of dream matter. So now I'm going to pass over to Iris.
Good morning. Wow, thank you, Cassie. What an amazing, I'm very, very honoured to be alongside these extraordinary people and to see all of you this morning. Thank you for being here. So my name's Iris. I am a co-creator of a project called New Constellations, which is, our mission as we framed it is to hold and grow space to imagine and create a future in which humanity and the planet can flourish together. So we've put imagination right at the heart of our mission. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about who we are and a recent project which I think can really illustrate the power of imagination, and was very kindly supported by the Emerging Futures Fund. So thank you to Cassie and team for making it possible. So why New Constellations? We are obviously fans of the stars, but the reason we have our name is that for millennia across cultures and continents, we've looked to the stars to navigate when we're lost. And in this moment of great upheaval and transformation, I'm sure lots of you, like us, feel a bit lost. So imagine you're on a little boat on choppy waters. If you orient it towards a constellation, you'll determine the course and the direction you're going to take, and therefore your destination. But the problem is that at the moment, it feels like we're locked onto some old stars and being guided by values and principles of a system that's pulling us in a direction that I, for one, don't really want to go. And we're telling ourselves pretty bleak dystopian stories about the future. Cassie's beautiful visualization was a really powerful counter to that. But you said, Cassie, you know, most of the time we're not telling us that story of the 2030 that turned out okay. So we need to chart a different course and tell a different story, and reset towards that better future that I really passionately believe is possible. And my background's in climate campaigning and policy, so I've got lots of reasons to think that we're in pretty big trouble. But I believe that better future is possible because we've been seeing it. We're seeing it everywhere, glinting in the dark like stars in the sky. In the work of these amazing people you've heard from this morning, the work that this forum is celebrating in all corners of the world, in new models and ideas that are emerging everywhere. So we have the great privilege at New Constellations of finding and mapping these glimmers and connecting and illuminating them to form new constellations of hope and possibility that we hope we can orient our lives and imaginations towards as we explore this huge question of what reorienting and true transformation is going to take. So we've been doing this at a quite kind of meta conceptual global level. And again, with amazing support from the Emerging Futures Fund, just before Christmas, we had the opportunity to explore how that kind of methodology could be applied at the community level. And we tried this for the first time in Barrow-in-Furness, a borough in the northwest of England that some of you may have heard of, but many of you may not. So Barrow is a place of great contrasts. It's an area with extreme challenges, of extreme deprivation. They have declared a poverty emergency. 40% of the children in the central ward in Barrow live in extreme poverty. It was named the UK's unhappiest place, which is no honour, and it was absolutely smashed by COVID-19. but it's also an incredible close-knit community with beautiful land and sea and an amazing group of doers and makers and innovators who I had the extreme privilege of getting to know a bit better at the end of last year. And they also have some big opportunities coming up. Those of you in the UK will know there's a big political conversation around levelling up and bringing resource to some of these communities. So Barrow is about to get some quite significant funding from central government to improve the area, but there was no kind of big vision or unifying story that the community could get behind in terms of how it wanted to use those opportunities and how it could pivot from this very kind of bleak story to creating a new future. So that's where we came in, and we worked with Barrow to create Barrow's new constellation, which was an immersive experiential journey to help the community dream and tell a new story about its future. We designed it in close partnership with the council and some amazing partners on the ground, as well as the author and social innovator Hilary Cottam, who some of you might know. And it was obviously, but it was held in full lockdown here in the UK. So we had to create it entirely through the realm of kind of imagination and beloved Zoom. But it was, we framed it around a kind of nautical voyage, and with lots of different kind of imaginative and experiential elements. We used audio recordings that the 15 people that we pulled together from all walks of life across Barrow could listen to and respond to down a phone line. There was individual and group work, reflective exercises, creative workshops. They had guided walks, meditations. We sent them beautiful packs in the post with handmade materials that they could use to inspire ideas. And we worked together over a full 6 days with these 15 people who, many of whom had never met each other, despite the fact that they lived within a few square miles. And it was incredibly powerful. We also invited the wider community to participate through a billboard and poster and radio campaign. So we tried to bring in as many people as possible. But for those 15 people who went on that journey described, and we were very humbled by their feedback. They described a really profound and many said spiritual experience. I love what you said, Emmy, about the imagination being a kind of an acceptable frame for the spiritual. And we found that, yeah, it was an experience that connected the community, the 15 people in the crew and the wider community in a way that they hadn't, that they reported having never done before, which in a time of such kind of separation in this physical realm felt like a really special thing. So I could say lots more about the journey, but I know we're short of time, and Cassie's kindly put a link up and I can share more. We've got a lovely recording as well on our website that I can direct link to if people want to hear a bit of the journey in the crew's own words, which is definitely the best way to understand it. But why does imagination matter so much? I think it matters because I truly believe that change starts with a new story of possibility. And as we saw in Barrow, the first step to embodying and co-creating new futures is being able to imagine and project ourselves into them. Because if we can't imagine them, I don't see how we can possibly build them. So in Barrow, for example, all the stories of the present and the future were negative. They called it Barrow bashing. And if all you do is Barrow bash and your collective story for your community and young people is Barrow bashing, then there's hardly any motivation or guidance to create and do something differently. The young and creative people just leave. One of the most moving things was there was a young queer man called Tom who joined our group and said that he'd seen no future for himself in Barrow, that he was afraid to be there and he needed to get out as soon as he can. And after being part of our experience and being able to imagine a different future, he said he felt safe and in and connected to his community for the first time. And that's like the highest praise I can imagine for my process. And you know, at a more global level, as I said, my background is 15 years in the climate movement. If our collective story is that we're doomed and everything's effed, how can we possibly really motivate and organize around something else? And yeah, so I see imagination as a critical piece of the puzzle of helping to build and orient towards and co-create that safer, fairer, more beautiful world. And just one last thing, and I'm short of time, but I really want to say that that doesn't mean I think we need some kind of inauthentic, like Pollyanna positivity, that everything's fine, because everything clearly is not fine. It's absolutely not fine. But I do feel that we can authentically and deeply feel and learn from and heal the pain of the present and the past without necessarily assuming we have to carry or project it into the future. And imagining our way into that healed, safer, better, more beautiful future is part of that process, a critical first step. So that's something we're trying to do in our small way with new constellations, and that this amazing panel is all doing in so many beautiful ways. And it's a long haul, but yeah, I think we can do it. Thank you.
Thanks, Iris. And yeah, I've put the audio for Barrow in the chat, and like as one of the people that was sort of resourcing the work, we got to hear some of the quotes from people taking part, and it really was transformative and like very profound for people. So it's been beautiful to watch that work happen. So Fazana.
Hi, good morning, folks. Thank you so much. When Cassie sent me the invite for this, I'd already kind of turned down going on a panel for something else amongst the symposium. And then I saw the speakers and I was like, I have to just hear them. And so it's such an honor to like share space with you all. And I feel really full. So thank you. I'm Fazana Khan. I'm a writer, I'm a cultural producer. I'm also one of the people behind Healing Justice London, and amongst a constellation and an ecology of incredible folks who are building on the intersections of understanding and repairing harm, violence, both structural and systemic, but also interpersonal and intimate, and really understanding that from an anti-oppression lens, the ways in which structures are sites of violence, particularly health and other public institutions, and what are the ways that communities that are subject to marginalization and harm can and are already actually reimagining, and what do these futures free of structural and intimate violence look and feel like. And when we say violence and trauma, they feel like lead balloons in conversations around imagining. But for us and for me personally, I think that it's the work of imagining that we're already in is not about escapism. It's about authenticating. It's about being honest. It's not about running away. It's about running towards. We're not leaving things behind, we're gathering. And I think those things are really, really important. And particularly a couple of years ago, Angela Davis, who's an incredible abolitionist visionary, had said to us, you are living in the imaginaries of people long gone before you, and one day people are going to live in the imaginaries that you create. And I think about who's imagining now and the privilege and the luxury. It's such a luxurious place. It's a yummy space, a dreamy space, as Emmy would say, that people get to imagine from. But there's a real weightedness around and responsibility when we think about imagining, because when we think about communities that are subject to harm and violence, and the physiological impact of being able to have foresight, to be able to trust in a future, to believe that your body will exist in a future, that you live in a world or a society that can contain and hold and allow you to thrive, is not often possible. Like our physiological, the ways that our bodies are impacted to be able to believe you exist. And as someone who's got a background in youth work, and I ran a festival on visionary futuring last year, or the year before, sorry, at the South Bank. And it was with young writers doing futurism and writing about futuristics. Possibilities, and a lot of them had said we can't actually imagine. And I think we have to hold that. We have to hold that right now, and what it means, and to dream, and what it means to imagine, and what are the capacities needed to create, to be able to imagine. And I think this brings us to a lot of the work that Healing Justice London is doing. We're really thinking about reconfiguring of realities, but what is the capacities and resources that many folks have touched on needed to build in. And if there are these architectures and algorithms that already determine our lives, in the inverse, what is the ecosystems and ecologies that we need to undo and unmake and create the safety, the belonging, the dignity that is needed. And so one of what I'm going to touch into is some of the approaches that we use in our work. And in particular, I want to bring in Christina Sharp, who is, again, a brilliant visionary and has written this brilliant book called In the Wake, on beingness and black and unbeingness. Somebody correct me because I may have said it wrong, or put it in the chat, please. But what Christina Sharp profoundly does in her book and in her practice is remind us that if we want to transform, we have to be honest. And she says, you know, we're living in the wake. We're not living in this post-colonial, post-racial world. We're actually living in the wake of enslavement. We're living in the wake of coloniality. But when we start being honest about it, it's one of the most capacious places to transform the world. And so it's these capacities of visionary organizing, of designing, that we're really curious and committed to. And what we're thinking about is we're concerned with the skills that need to be developed to be able to do that. Because when we're designing these futures, the what is so often, when it comes to marginalized communities, not even where we can, it's not even heard with the things that are already being designed, already the ways that we're surviving are erased or not paid attention to. So the what is not what we're thinking about, but we're thinking about how, and what are the skills that allow you to restore agency to be able to determine the what. Some of the approaches that we're really thinking about as part of democratizing, as part of building that civic power, that people power, and that run through all our programs, all our projects, it's just so pervasive in the ways that we do, are about, you know, not fixing on something that is contingent on the moment or the context, but something that can transcend, something that belongs to you, and that from that space you are able to design and create. Some of those approaches that we draw from, that we are building on, are always thinking about how to be trauma informed, understanding that it's not about participation, it's about meaningful presence. How do people get to show up? And it's not performative. We think about disability justice. What does it mean to understand the wholeness of a being and a body, and the ways in which our bodies are brutalized by systems and structures, and also the eugenics and the coloniality that is present in our understandings of the body. We think about being led by those with lived experience, really those that are already imagining and innovating and with a genius, but are seen as outside of the peripheries of the state, or even outside of our imaginative landscapes. We think a lot and build on a lot around abolition. And I want to bring this in because, you know, it's relentless, the level of police brutality, state violence that many of us are aware of, have experienced. And abolition as a framework is already a tool that is inviting us to reimagine everything. All the things that we perceive to make us safe, to make us healthy, are actually still sites of harm. So how do we lean into that invitation and get behind this movement of really building infrastructures at the heart, are building safety, are building community, are inviting us to do and practice that. The last thing, and this is the thing that I will close on, and I think it's central to our work, is embodied liberation. And I say embodied liberation because the body is a site of imagining, and coloniality, capitalism, racial capitalism, neoliberalism is inviting us to leave our bodies behind. And it's inviting particularly communities that are racialized, queer bodies, Muslim bodies, disabled bodies, particularly to leave their bodies behind. And a lot of our spiritual and indigenous and cultural traditions know that the body is a site of knowledge, and it's a site of wisdom, and it's also a site of imagining and inquiry. So that embodied liberation is really that space for us that we want to return to, that we want to use as an apparatus to feel into the liberated futures we're calling in. And so I think this is the space that I want to kind of close on, that when we're thinking about calling in the futures that we are dreaming of, how can it authenticate us? How can it make us more true, more accountable to one another? How can it help us foster that interdependence? And what will it feel like? And in particular, what will it feel to those bodies we're not even imagining? So yeah, thank you. I will close here.
Thank you, Fazana. I always learn something new every time I hear you speak. You're so wise. And yeah, so there's so much there, I think, that you've heard from the four speakers. And every day, like, I'm learning from working with people like you to help us think about how to resource this, and if infrastructuring or infrastructures is about capacity and care, it feels like there's a lot more capacity and a lot more care needed to create these spaces, to create like to think about who is and isn't able to imagine and be in this. So yeah, I just feel lucky to be learning with you all. I haven't seen any questions in the chat apart from Emmy asking me things in DM. So I don't know if anyone does have a question. I also did want to just give a shout out to Amara's here. Don't feel you have to say anything, Amara, unless you want to, who is also doing, Emmy mentioned their work earlier in the chat, but I'm just going to put another link because they've got some amazing, the Maya group, they've got some amazing imagination type events coming up, building on a lot of the work they're already doing. And Amara's also curating a panel for us. We're doing an event on the 10th of June on imagination infrastructure, where Amara will be curating a whole panel. So yeah, there's a question here about how can we mainstream all of this more. So I don't know who on the speaker panel wants to pick up that. I don't feel like I should pick on you, so I'm going to invite one of you to maybe talk about that, or a couple of you, because we've still got time.
I'll happily kick off, but I'm hoping that the others will pick up from this, because I'm only going to say one part of it. I think it is fair to say there are lots of things mainstreaming this, right? Like, there are lots of things, from funders to what's becoming acceptable, to people finding new ways to find belonging and spirituality, as perhaps organized religion and other things are dissipating in different ways, and that brings out all sorts of different experiences. You've got people like the Lottery putting it right at the heart of their work. However, I think there's a big however here for me, which is, we can talk about all those routes to transition and all those different parts, but we're still sat within a profoundly sick system, right? And there are a lot of things that, if we can start to dismantle hospice, put away economic systems, usher in new realities, this will start to become mainstream in a way that is much more our everyday embodied experiences, of which I think Fazana and Rabab especially can speak to much more. But I think it's really important to just not get stuck on tools and programs and funding and forget that those are only sticky plasters for the fact that we're here in the first place because of some really sick, unhealthy, unnurtured soil that actually would create our most liberated, imaginative, fulfilled selves. And I'm going to stop there because somebody else can come in and build on that. But I just, because of the forum we're in, I definitely think there's such a lot of like tools and funding and all of this and infrastructure. And yes, I think all of those matter, but I do think really deepening some of the things that have been talked about today matter as well, simultaneously, because I think that inner work and that collective work has to happen alongside all of the, you know, organizing that we do.
I'm happy to pick up from Emmy, thank you. I think I'm definitely committed to building fluency between the mainstream and the margins, but I am conscious about us mainstreaming, because we have to, as Emmy has touched on, the ways in which power dynamics mean that there is a parachuting, but also what we see happen so often is the co-option of our most radical ideas, which then get diluted. And I know Rabab also touched on this in what you were saying. So I'm curious about how we interrogate power. Again, returning to the skills work. How do we become skilled at discerning what is for us, what we get behind, what we uplift, what we are listening to, and how do we help things travel in its most authentic way? And how do we help things catalyze in a way that feels appropriate to the context? And also, there's nothing wrong with things staying small. I love Grace Lee Boggs, you know, talks about critical connection over critical mass. And I think we could all like learn a lot from that. So I'll hand over. I think Rabab, you were going to come in.
Yeah, I mean, all of that really resonates. I'm in a really similar place. I really always want to question why scale up, why mainstream, what is the process that gets lost, and who actually gets lost when the default is to do that. And I actually think part of the mainstreaming is having these very critical dialogues so that our institutions understand what we're talking about and actually support the infrastructures and the resource to enable that, and to enable that with a certain level of trust. I think that's what a very first port of call for mainstreaming is. But I really feel that the kind of things everyone is talking about and the kind of processes we're talking about are hugely time consuming. So when Fazana, when you talked about, like, I suppose the luxury of the imagination for so many of our communities who are literally having to deal with multiple forms of structural violence. They're having to deal with living in survival mode. They're having to deal with enormous precarity. Like the idea that we can all sit around and talk about the imagination or what we're imagining for the future. The space needed to create the safety and to create the trust, and then to create the spaces of healing, to build the village that's going to raise our children. Like these I think demand so much. My concern would be that we are constantly moving away from those spaces in order to mainstream something, whereas it feels like we require huge amounts of time to keep those models safe, to keep them viable, and also to keep them democratized and to keep them led by, I suppose, you know, people on the ground. And then the other thing I just want to really make a case for is the amount of internal work like we as organizations need to do to be on the right side of all of that, to really be checking in with the power dynamics within our own spaces. I think one of the reasons that perhaps, I don't want to speak for anyone else, but some of us, certainly myself, have become quite disillusioned with a lot of, I suppose, activism, forms of political campaigning, is we lack perhaps the very spiritual spaces that have been touched on, the dynamics and often painful work of interpersonal relations that we need to be working on in order to model what this looks like, in order to model what we're imagining. Like, it's deep work that we have to take time in our organization. And sometimes I'm like, we're not going fast enough because we're spending time trying to model really truthfully and authentically what that looks like. So it takes time.
Thank you, Rabab, and everyone. I'm sorry, we've got lots of new questions and we won't have time for them, but I'm going to save them, and it might be that we write a shared blog or something if I can co-opt a bit more of their time with you know, we could like publish some answers to those questions. I've got to remember to tell you all to go back to Hopin, but I just want to say thank you to all of our speakers it's been a lovely start to my day, and I hope it has for all of those that have joined us. Thank you for coming, and see you again somewhere in our dreams, maybe. All right. Bye.